Texas, autumn 1945. A flatbed truck stopped beneath an open sky, and a line of women stepped down into a place they had been told would hold punishment. Red dust clung to the soles of their boots, to the hems of skirts, to the edges of a single blanket folded over a shoulder. The sergeant called names from a clipboard. Then, in a voice as ordinary as a weather report, he gave an order that felt like a verdict. Inside, undress. The sound of that sentence landed like a stone. A smell of oil and warm wood met their faces, the tang of metal from boots, the slight soap scent that seemed almost a betrayal. Anneliese Krueger, 23, felt her fingers go numb as if someone had taken the heat from them. The promise here is not spectacle, but a different kind of surprise, something efficient that looks like mercy and functions like power. In the next 20 minutes, you will see how routine became a tool, how procedures wrote new rules for dignity and humiliation, and why that ordinary order still unsettles history. By late 1945, there were thousands of Axis prisoners scattered across the southern United States under Army custody. In Texas alone, the military reported more than 3,000 German prisoners held in a network of camps that were part prison and part logistical node for repatriation. The journey had been long. Cargo ships crossed the Atlantic and trains cut inland, their cars full of patched uniforms and papers. The convoy that arrived on a dry weekday carried 43 women transferred from a naval facility in Florida after a month of processing. They expected reception, they expected interrogation, some expected violence. Instead, they were handed lists, numbered tokens, a schedule pinned to a wooden board. The transportation itself was a study in logistics. Men in crisp uniforms managed manifests, counted heads against rosters, noted medical summaries on paper forms that would travel with each body. The contrast between the salty tracks of the crossing and the systematic ticking of a camp ledger was a lesson in modern war administration. The guards who met them had been trained to turn human chaos into columns and check marks. Soap and water were on the inventory sheet. Towels were listed under reissue. The Red Cross inspection had been scheduled for the following week, and its report would cite compliance. Yet compliance and humanity do not always align. What the paperwork could not show were the small calibrations of shame and relief inside a barrack when you are told to undress in front of strangers. They disembarked beneath a low wooden gate and formed a line on cracked earth. Captain Hayes stood at the gate with a clipboard and a face that did not make promises. Sergeant Miller called names aloud. The intake process was precise. One by one, the women stepped forward to be registered, to hand over personal effects, to be assigned a number. A nurse in a white apron signed the medical ledger while an interpreter, Hans Bauer, scribbled translations. Anneliese watched as another woman, Marta Klein, handed over a locket and received in exchange a thin sheet of paper with her number stamped on it. The clerks moved like a machine. A short exchange unfolded at the table between Sergeant Miller and Anneliese that would mark how the day felt. "Name," he said, voice steady. "Anneliese Krueger," she replied. "Age, 23. Origin, Hamburg. Any wounds?" "Just a scar from shrapnel on the left wrist." "All right," he said, stamping the paper. "Follow Nurse Collins." "Do we get visits?" Marta asked. "No," Hayes said. "Only Red Cross and official channels." "How long will we stay?" Anneliese asked, and Miller looked at his clipboard as if the answer was written in ink on the sky. "Until repatriation is scheduled," he said. "We process according to Geneva and Army procedure." This short legal language had the effect of narrowing options. The women who had been told to expect cruelty now felt a more subtle squeezing, a removal of context in favor of form. Inside the washroom hall, steam rose in columns, and the light slatted through high windows. The air smelled of boiled water, soap, damp wool, and sweat. Metal hooks lined the walls. A barrel of hot water hissed at one end, its rim rimmed with rust. Nurse Collins directed them with the same calm she used to administer shots. "Strip, place clothes in the bin, 1 towel each, quick," she told them. There was a rhythm to the motion that felt ritualistic. Anneliese glanced at Ingrid Vogel, who squeezed her hand and whispered a joke that dissolved into a sob. There was a corporal standing by the doorway saying, in a voice meant to be simple, "This is for health. This is not punishment." A short dialogue between Anneliese and the nurse unfolded as steam rolled over their shoulders. "Do I keep my locket?" Anneliese asked, voice low. The nurse hesitated. "We log valuables," she said. "If it matters, tell me now." "It matters," Anneliese said. "It is the only thing from Mother." The nurse nodded and wrote it down. "We will put it in the safe and return it with your papers," she said. "Promise?" Anneliese asked. "By protocol," the nurse answered. The water hit their skins, hot and then mercilessly cool. Hands rubbed at grime. The soap scratched like new paper against the skin. The towel took the last heat away. The exchange of clothing for a plain reissue blouse and trousers was mechanical, and yet the touch of the fabric felt like a change of name. This moment is small, but it pivoted lives. The bath was not a spectacle of cruelty. It was a point where discipline became intimate, and where some felt grateful and others felt violated. The camp operated on a schedule that turned human time into blocks on a ledger. Breakfast at dawn, work details at 8, roll call at noon, letters processed in the afternoon, lights out at 10. The commander kept reports that read like accounting ledgers and like weather entries. Meals were measured by ounces, clothing by size, soap by bar count. In the mess hall, trays clanged, steam rose from soup bowls, and the bread had a faint sour smell that marked rationing. There were rules about how many could be assigned to latrine duty, how many could be sent to a work detail cutting timber, and how many could receive medical attention in a week. Captain Hayes made daily notations: 43 transferred, 2 with untreated dental problems, 1 case shortlisted for repatriation approval. The vocabulary of the camp included terms like reissue, inspection, and repatriate, words that moved people into categories. Discipline was enforced not only through commands, but through forms that were signed, stamped, filed, and duplicated. Anneliese noted the precision of the system and how it turned gestures of care into checkboxes. The Red Cross inspector would later write that the camp met conditions. The women compared that endorsement with the taste of the bread and the cadence of roll call. Some found relief in structure after months of chaos. Others experienced the same mechanism as an extension of the war, a new battlefield where dignity was rationed with the soap. Within the routines, small resistances cropped up and then either withered or shifted into cooperation. Anneliese did not intend to collaborate, but she negotiated survival. At first, she refused to exchange letters without supervision, insisting on privacy. She argued with an interpreter, Hans, demanding that a note to her sister be delivered without censorship. Their conversation spiraled into a series of measured exchanges that showed how one woman learned to translate resistance into leverage. "You cannot read this," she told him. "I will see it," he said. "Why should you decide?" "Because I work here," Hans replied. "Because you are not trusted," Anneliese shot back. "Your job is to make us legible to them," she said. "My job is to keep you alive," Hans countered. "If you refuse, the letter will not go." "Then I will speak only in names," she said. "Do that," he said with a softness that surprised her. "Start with Marta and imagine your mother." Each line of that exchange carried a small calculus. Over time, Anneliese learned the rhythm of bargaining. She agreed to serve on a distribution detail, a role that brought proximity to the storeroom and the person who dispensed soap and towels. From resistance to cautious cooperation, her arc was not about betrayal, but about negotiation with an institutional perimeter that defined every action. Anneliese came from a port neighborhood of Hamburg, the daughter of a baker and a seamstress who taught her how to mend not only cloth, but ways of living after loss. The earliest memory she recorded in a scrap of paper she kept folded in her shoe was the day the bakery door closed for lack of sugar. Her teenage years had been measured by sirens and ration cards. She learned shorthand from a school teacher who hid it in grammar exercises. When her father was drafted and did not return, she took odd jobs to keep the household afloat. She married a man who later went to the front and returned with a limp and with secrets that tightened his jaw. Her sister Anna taught her to read by candlelight after the blackout curtains had been closed. Anneliese remembered being 21 on a ship leaving a port filled with smoke. She was captured by naval patrols after a short skirmish and then moved through processing centers before arriving in the United States. These paragraphs of memory were stitched to dates, names, and an old ribbon from her mother that she kept pinned to the inside of her blouse. The backstory explains why she was cautious, why the feeling of being cataloged felt like a repetition of other losses, and why the return of a locket mattered as a small claim to continuity. It also explains her language of negotiation, taught by necessity and tempered by the austerity of a childhood where goods and gestures had to be bartered. Her personal archive shows a life not defined by ideology but by tasks and by the quiet labor of keeping household and heart intact. There were moments where the narrative slowed and the pressure of choice thickened. One afternoon at work detail, the women were ordered to clear a fallen fence line after a storm, and a small argument broke into a tense standoff about whose shift it was to carry a heavy post. The sun pressed on their backs, dust filled mouths, boots sank into mud. Voices rose and the corporal barked the word settle. For a full minute, the women stood frozen, hands on the wood, measuring who would yield and who would risk the reprisal of a mark in the ledger. Anneliese felt the past crowding the present, the ledger a mirror of ration books, and a refusal to comply suddenly meant losing access to the mess hall. The dispute resolved not by authority, but by a loose vote among the women, a quiet redistribution of burden that left each exhausted and furtive. That pause was a small republic where agency survived within a system designed to suppress it. Another slow moment occurred late at night when Anneliese sat on a bunk mending a shirt under a single bulb and thought of the locket in the safe. The barrack hummed with the snores and sighs of others. Rain tapped the roof in a rhythm that matched the pattern of stitches. A rat scraped somewhere behind a food crate. The quiet stretched so that every small sound became an accusation. In that silence, she imagined the letter to Anna being censored, cut like a page torn from a book. Her hands hovered over the needle, and she realized that a single act of preserving a piece of cloth was an act of remembering. The tension there was not loud but deep. It lasted many minutes and reshaped how she arranged her days thereafter. When the story widened into analysis, it became clear that this episode was a small example of a larger paradox. Military administration in the post-war period learned to use routine as a technology of power. Rules replaced hatred and replaced spectacle. Discipline operated through forms that pretended to care. The camp had procedures that matched Geneva standards and paperwork, even while the lived experience varied. Organization can be benevolent and can be coercive at once. The language of logistics made decisions feel neutral when in truth they always carried moral weight. The commanders spoke of repatriation timelines and postal quotas, while the women lived the arithmetic in their skin. One can count soap bars per person and still miss the way shame circulates when bodies are made legible on lists. This paradox is at the core of how modern institutions govern populations after conflict. It asks whether efficiency can ever be innocent when used to process people who have been stripped of autonomy. If you felt the same shock that many did at the moment they were asked to undress, you are not alone. That reaction is part of a common human response to exposure and to the sudden reordering of privacy by authority. We want to hear from you. Tell us where you are watching from and which single word from this story hit you hardest. Was it the word soap, order, register, or locket? Start your comment with "my word was," and then the word, and a sentence about why. Your responses help other viewers see different angles and often shape the questions we pursue next. The community that gathers under this channel has guided research, suggested archives, and helped us find letters like the ones Anneliese wrote. Your comment can also be the start of a memory shared. Now we return to the timeline and to the outcomes that followed from that day of paperwork and bathing. 1 month later, the camp records noted that all 43 women remained healthy and that 24 had been classified as eligible for a repatriation transport pending approval from higher command. The report was dry. It listed rations delivered, numbers of sick, and the number of letters processed, 72 in total for that month. In private, the women passed notes about small changes. Marta received her locket back after a misfiled report was corrected. Anneliese learned that the nurse had recorded the possession under a different name and had to appeal. The soap remained a contentious symbol. To some, it was relief. To others, a reminder that cleanliness could be administered like power. A Red Cross representative visited and wrote a paragraph in the inspection ledger about humane conditions, but also noted that the psychological toll of processing had not been measured. The ledger did not know how to record the exact shape of a woman's relief when she read a letter from a sister. Informal networks inside the barracks shifted. Some women offered craft lessons in the evenings in exchange for extra soup portions. The communal ritual of mending became a small economy. 3 months later, official correspondence began to travel more quickly. Repatriation slots opened and closed according to diplomatic negotiations and shipping space. A list circulated that included 8 names from the camp for the next scheduled transport. Tensions rose when Anna Krueger's name did not appear. Anneliese wrote to the camp commander, citing illness in the family, and the reply was procedural and terse. The system had language for emergencies, but it required documentation and a signature. The women took to compiling affidavits and testimonies, sometimes asking sympathetic guards to vouch for them in official memo form. Hans the interpreter began to speak with Captain Hayes privately about health cases, about how to expedite certain files. Cooperation and advocacy blurred boundaries. The camp's paper trail thickened into a map of favors granted and withheld. At the same time, local townspeople brought donations, jars of jam and a bag of flour, small goods that confounded the strict lines of custody and kindness. The presence of those items created their own moral questions for the staff who logged them into the inventory. 6 months after arrival, a transport left for a northern port with 16 women from the camp among several hundred transferred from across the region. Officially, the movement was a success. The camp roster reflected the departure with neat ticks and initials. Anneliese remained behind on a list that said pending due to insufficient documentation, though in private she had been told that administrative backlog was to blame. The little ribbon pinned inside her blouse had faded but not disappeared. When she finally received word that repatriation had been scheduled, she stitched the ribbon into a patch on a shirt and carried it like a secret signal. Returning to civilian life would be complicated. Some of the women repatriated quickly, reintegrated, and reported receiving government allowances for displaced persons. Others arrived to destroyed homes, missing families, and bureaucracies that did not recognize their paperwork. The soap that had seemed a small domestic object in the camp reappeared in letters as a symbol of care from strangers for those who had none. The ledger of the camp continued to exist, but now it was a document among many in a larger archive that historians would later comb for meaning. They were cataloged, washed, numbered, and in the end, moved again by schedules drawn far from their beds. The story does not resolve into a single moral. It leaves a question about how order functions after violence. The camp taught a lesson about authority that was not always brutal, but that was always administrative. It is possible to look at the soap and see mercy. It is possible to look at the soap and see a tool of control. The final tally in the regional report listed 3,200 German prisoners processed that year and 120 documented repatriations in the following 6 months. Those numbers describe movement, but not memory. They do not tell you what it is like to receive a locket returned in a brown envelope, or to sleep under a single bulb while rain punctuates the roof. The war ends on battlefields and in treaties, but it continues in forms and in files. If this account moved you, subscribe to hear more stories that trace how small routines shape lives.